Joe Henderson, Grant Green, Lee Morgan, Stanley Turrentine, Horace Silver, Sonny Rollins, and many, many, many others. What was the glue that held these legendary sessions together? The groove that propelled these and thousands of other recording sessions. His name was Bob Cranshaw, and he was one of the most prolific bassists in the history of jazz music. His career spanned over 60 years to include recordings, television, and Broadway shows. Bob also paved the way for the modern bass doubler by being equally in demand on electric bass and upright bass before it was in vogue. Bob's giving spirit and deep pocket made every musical endeavor he was involved with a special one. If you play bass, and especially jazz bass, Bob Cranshaw is someone you should definitely know about. Male-born Robert Cranshaw was born on December 3rd, 1932 in Chicago, Illinois. He grew up in nearby Evanston in a musical household. Bob started out as a percussionist before switching to double bass. Following his saxophone-playing brother's lead, he dove into jazz. It wasn't long before he was making his way up through the ranks of the fertile jazz scene in Chicago. In 1959 came his first brush with greatness when he played with saxophonist Sonny Rollins at the inaugural Playboy Jazz Festival. Listen to Sonny tell the story about how they hooked up.
I was stuck for a bass play, and somebody said, well, there's this guy, Bob Cranshaw, he might be able to do it. So, okay, short notice, he came by, and we were playing a song, whatever it was, I don't remember exactly, but I made a, what you call a transformation. In music, we call it a modulation. You go from one key to another key. The same song, but changing keys. So I made a modulation at a certain point in the song is proper to make this modulation. Sure enough, Bob made the modulation with me. So after he did that, then I said, yeah, this guy we're on the same wavelength.
Thus began Bob's 50-plus year association with the jazz icon. A musical relationship that produced over 20 albums, beginning with 1962's The Bridge, which ushered in Sonny's triumphant return to the scene after a 3-year sabbatical. Cranshaw was a mainstay of Sonny Rollins' groups, playing in various styles, with various configurations on upright and electric bass for most of his career. As Bob put it, his relationship with Sonny lasted longer than both of his marriages. Bob would relocate from Chicago to New York City in 1960. His Chicago group MJT Plus 3 would play an engagement at the city's famous 5-spot jazz club that would bring him to New York and keep him there. It was during the 1960s that Bob Cranshaw would stake his name as one of the most prolific bassists in jazz music. Not only did he play gigs with people like Ella Fitzgerald, Duke Ellington, Coleman Hawkins, and Thelonious Monk during this time, Bob would also become one of the most in-demand and recorded musicians in jazz, making significant albums for Blue Note Records, Prestige, Verve, Riverside, and just about every other major jazz label during that time, with people like Bobby Hutcherson, Dexter Gordon, Donald Byrd, Carmen McRae, Wes Montgomery, Hank Mobley, and many, many, many others. Bob's big sound, his buoyant timekeeping, his professionalism, his reliability, and his musical attitude made him among the most in-demand musicians in New York for almost 5 decades.
I like to help with the pocket. You know, I like to play the notes, the bottom, the basic bottom of the chord, but I also like a groove, I like a pocket.
If he never did anything else, Bob Cranshaw would go down in history for his contributions to jazz music alone. But he didn't stop there. After a car accident left him with some serious back problems, he decided, well, I guess I better pick up the electric bass now. And he didn't miss a beat. Bob played in a band led by Billy Taylor for David Frost's weekly TV show. He played jingles for commercials, and he played in pit orchestras for Broadway shows like Jesus Christ Superstar. In 1968, he met composer-pianist Joe Raposo while playing for an off-Broadway show called House of Flowers. This would be another very significant relationship for him. This is where I first heard Bob Cranshaw.
Rubber ducky, you're the one. You make bath time lots of fun.
In 1969, a radical new children's TV show was being developed by public television called Sesame Street. Sesame Street used puppets and live actors and music to teach children in a way that was never seen before on television. Joe Raposo, with his Broadway background, was tasked with writing and producing the music for it. Bob spent over 25 years playing bass for the music of Sesame Street and the Electric Company, and generations of children like myself were raised listening to his funky bass lines on our favorite TV shows, like this one.
Here's something terrific for kids who like to play with their food. Daffy Taffy. It's stretchy.
For the rest of his life, if you ran into Bob, he was usually wearing some kind of piece of clothing from Sesame Street, whether it was a shirt with a logo on it or a jacket. He was very proud of the work that he had done on the show and always honored to be a part of it. But he wasn't done yet. Bob appeared on Paul Simon's album There Goes Rhymin' Simon in 1973, and in 1975 was recruited by music director Howard Shore to join another band for a live, late-night, weekend, experimental sketch comedy show on NBC called Saturday Night, later known as Saturday Night Live. Bob Cranshaw was the original bassist for SNL from 1975 to 1978 until a teenager named Marcus Miller took over for him. If you look really hard, you can spot him playing behind Steve Martin in the original King Tut sketch from April of 1978. Bob continued to make high-profile jazz gigs with Sonny Rollins, vibraphonist Milt Jackson, and even recorded with Antonio Carlos Jobim on an album called Terra Brasilis in 1980. He would go on to teach at the New School in New York. Among his most enduring quotes was, "A bass is a bass is a bass." He would play with anyone, anywhere, if it allowed him to make a groove happen, regardless of the gig. He would often say, "My goal was to make that person over there in the wheelchair stand up and dance before the end of the night." He loved great bass playing, and he loved great bass soloists, although he never considered himself one of them. His greatest joy, as he said, was in throwing blocks so that the other musicians could score the touchdowns. He was selfless, both as a musician and as a person. During the height of his success in the 60s, he was often known to turn down work because he wanted other bass players to be working as well. He was also heavily involved in the Musicians Union when he retired in the late 90s and had a sizable pension from his body of work over the years. He never stopped fighting for musicians and their rights, particularly jazz musicians, as a leader and a member of New York Local 802. When Bob would teach, he called it the Milt Hinton method. Now, this was not a practical, technical, physical playing method. This was based on how giving Milt Hinton was as a mentor to Bob and many others. When Bob came to New York, he was on his way to a rehearsal with his bass in a raggedy bag that was falling apart. It was all he could afford at the time. A man in a tie walked up to him and asked him his name. He told him, and then the man asked, "Are you a professional bassist?" To which he said, "Yes, sir." The man said, "I'm Milt Hinton," and he took Bob into Manny's Music on West 48th Street and bought him a new bass case on the spot. Bob would continue to follow the Milt Hinton method for the rest of his life. I can't begin to tell you how many young bassists Bob Cranshaw has connected with and mentored through the years, including myself. In 1995, I was barely 21, and I was living with my grandmother and trying to figure out jazz. One day I got a phone call from a noted jazz DJ in town named Butch Perkins. When I called Butch back, he told me that Bob Cranshaw was desperately trying to get a hold of me. That Bob Cranshaw? Well, as it turns out, I got him on the phone, and he was coming to town to play with Milt Jackson. He told me they had a 4-night engagement, Thursday through Sunday, but because of another commitment, he couldn't be there until Friday. And he asked me if I wanted to play with Milt Jackson for one night to sub for him. He told me the pay was $150 or $175 for one gig in a really great hall with Milt Jackson. So naturally, I was in over my head, but I took the gig in a second. We worked it out that I would come back to the gig later on that weekend to hear the band, and then he would pay me backstage. When the gig came up, I got to play with Milt Jackson. I got to play with Ben Riley on the drums, Mike LaDon on piano, and it was one of the greatest musical experiences of my life. And not only that, it was a double bill with Gary Burton. In the end of the show, the two of them played together, so I got to play with Milt Jackson and Gary Burton at the same time, which was unbelievable. I came back to the venue on that Sunday to come hear the show that afternoon and to go backstage. After the show, there was Bob waiting for me in the dressing room. He had on a jean jacket with an embroidered Sesame Street logo on it, and he took out $300 bills in cash. And he placed them on the counter. And he told me to come and get my money. And I picked up the money, and he opened up his arms and gave me the biggest hug I can remember getting. He was amazing and warm, and this was my first time meeting him, but definitely not my last. We stayed in touch through the years. I was a guest in his home. He gave me an electric bass, and I let him use my gear when he would come into Pittsburgh to play. And he gave me advice every time we talked. Advice that I'll never forget. He told me to take whatever gig came my way, whether it was a show or a folk singer or a bar mitzvah. He said, take them all and make them groove hard, because you have something to learn in every musical experience. And he always made me feel, from the first time I talked to him to the last, that I was the greatest bass player in the world. He gave me confidence, and I will never forget him for that. Bob died of cancer in November of 2016, just a month shy of his 84th birthday. Bob Cranshaw was a powerhouse. He had a sound and a groove that lit up any gig that was lucky enough to have him. In my opinion, his story is just as significant as in any Paul Chambers or Ron Carter in the jazz world. Beyond that, as a musician and as a person, he gave us all much more than he ever took. His legacy will live on, not just on all the incredible records he made, but through bassists like Tom Barney and Daryl Johns, drummer Steve Jordan, and myself, and many, many others that were lucky enough to be blessed by him. When I think of Bob, I think of some of my favorite records, but I also think of his smile, his warmth, his joy, and his artistry that elevated whatever music he was making. So do yourself a favor and check him out. I'd like to give a special thanks to the one and only jazz video guy, Brett Primack, for allowing me to access his video library for some of the clips that you've seen of Bob's. He's got one of the most amazing jazz archives of videos that you've ever seen, and I highly suggest that you check out his channel, which will be linked below in the description. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up, and please consider subscribing to this channel for exclusive weekly jazz bass centric content coming at you as fast as I can produce it. Until next time, take care of yourself, and please love your neighbor.